I'm Rachel Skroback, and I'm the content marketing manager here at Matik. And we're all very excited to have you guys here for our new webinar, which is using data to build trust with your customers. So Spencer, I'll go ahead and pass it over to you, and we can go ahead and get started.
Great. Thanks, Rachel. Hey, everyone. I'm Spencer Davison. I'm the head of technical account management over at Matik. Today, we're going to be showing how to build data-driven stories in order to build trust with your customers. I've spent my career working with data and showing the value of insights to customers, whether that's in consulting or marketing from there. And then before Matik, I was with LinkedIn, where data was really the core value of what we brought to our customers. But here at Matik, we use our platform to scale insights. And the way we do that is we'll connect to a customer's data source, and we'll create what we call dynamic content in order to generate presentations automatically. So what used to take a few hours only takes a few seconds with Matik. Let's jump into it. So if you want to go to the next slide, Rachel. So why data-driven content? As you probably heard way too many times, data really is the new currency of today. But there's a good reason for that. And the reason is it really provides the strongest supporting evidence of the value of your product or service to your customers. If data is not shown appropriately, or if data insights aren't part of a story, that value dissipates. So it's really about how that connects to the value and goals of the organization that you're working with. And we really value the data at Matik, and we really work with our customers to ensure that the presentations they create are really data-driven, but also story-driven. And when you blend those two together, you are really prone for success in your business. I want to jump to the next slide. All right, so really today we're going to go through the 4 steps of creating data-driven content. The first step is to define the customer journey. If you're not defining the customer journey up front, you run the risk of showing the wrong information at the wrong time. You really should be figuring out the key steps in a customer's lifecycle, and then putting 2 stories together that work towards a common objective. And defining the customer journey is the first part of that. The second step is figuring out the story you want to tell. There's a few components to this, but one of the key components is really making sure that there's direct feedback, and we'll be getting into that in a bit. Third step is determining the data that you need to support that story. Like I mentioned earlier, if you are just putting data on a chart or putting a bunch of key figures on a slide to show to your customers or prospects, you're running the risk of not telling the story or muddling the message that you intend on giving. That's why you really need to determine the data you need, and we'll be discussing that in a bit. The fourth step is scale. So once you've decided the journey that you want your customer to be on, the story you want to tell, and the data that's needed to support that story, you're ready to scale that to your go-to-market teams and really make sure that that message is being heard by a broad audience. So if we go to the next slide. All right, let's get digging into defining the customer journey. So if you want to go to the next slide, Rachel. So really, this is a very generic customer journey, but this is really what we mean when we're talking about the journey a customer will be on. And different stages of the customer journey will require different stories to be told. And each stage is really important to define up front. Now, like I said, this is kind of a generic overview, but it will probably fit in under these buckets broadly. At each point, as I mentioned, is a chance to prove your value to your customers. So for instance, during the onboarding stage, you're really outlining the goals of the customer and what they're trying to achieve. And then through adoption, renewal, and expansion, you're proving the value of your product or service by realigning with those goals with data-driven supporting evidence. Let's jump to the next step of the process to create data-driven content. So figuring out the story you want to tell. Like I mentioned before, figuring out the story you want to tell is a critical part of making sure that the story, it matches the message and the audience that is receiving that message. So let's talk about some musts in data storytelling. The first is probably a bit obvious, but it's also something that people commonly mistake, which is keeping your customers in mind. A lot of times people will be developing data stories in a vacuum. It'll be based on limited actual engagement from your frontline reps, and more be developed in a vacuum of what you want to develop rather than what your customer wants to hear. So keeping your customers in mind, validating in front of them is very important. The second is making sure your narratives tie together. We often talk about the importance of transitions in accounts, but it's also important to make sure that transitions between steps of the customer lifecycle match up. Narratives should build on one another, and they should tie back to one another. So what are the goals from the onboarding stage? And then how are those goals being achieved during the renewal and expansion phases? And how is the data evidence that you're presenting being supported from that start of contract to the end of it? It's really critical that your narratives are flowing together, that your message is in sync, and that it's aligned with what the customer expects. The last is around getting external and internal feedback. Again, keeping similar to keeping your customer in mind, you really shouldn't be developing anything in a vacuum. You should be validating and iterating. One of the things that we constantly really strive for in Matik is making sure that presentations that are developed in Matik and continue to be used in Matik are being iterated on over time. It's really important that presentations don't become stale, that you're listening to feedback, what works, what doesn't, what people want to hear, and how your product is evolving over time, and how the information you're presenting aligns with that. Thirdly, and most excitingly for me, determining the data you need. So let's talk about how we really think about the hierarchy of data. So why don't we start with account data first? Account data is really the general data you'll have on your accounts as you get kicked off with them. So think about data that's in your CRM, their goals of the organizations, what they're trying to achieve with your product or service, basic information on the account. Those are broadly available and widely used, but it's pretty basic information that they probably already know. The second most used sort of data category is around usage data. This is maybe a little bit more difficult to get, and even more difficult to get efficiently. But it's not necessarily as valuable to a customer because it's basic adoption and usage stats on your product or service, and it's maybe not something that aligns with what they're really wanting to see out of your platform. So let's talk about really what tops out the hierarchy of data, which is ROI. And as you'll see, this is all building on each other. ROI data, the reason it's the most critical and probably the least used is it's critical because it is aligning your product with actual ROI and value that they want to be seeing from it. So if you're talking to an economic buyer, did they purchase your product? Is it leading to better business outcomes for them? How are you returning the investment that they made into you? And it doesn't necessarily need to be dollar ROI, but it can be a lot of things that would contribute to positive business outcomes. And that's really critical to understand. And it's really critical that you get to that point with your customers. And one of the biggest reasons for that is when you go into a renewal conversation, you're less likely to be talking to the program manager at an account or mid-level manager. You could be talking to an executive that might not know the ins and outs of your product, but they do know value. And that's really important for you to communicate with them. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so let's see how this kind of maps up with the customer journey. So we talked about account data. Again, this is a little bit more important early on, just generally coming to your first account or your first kickoff with an account with a basic understanding of what they're trying to accomplish with with your product. Adoption, this is where usage data is really important. People often ask, what if the usage data is bad? Good. That's a good opportunity. If it looks good, then even better. But if it doesn't, early on in a contract, that's not a negative thing. In fact, that helps you build trust as an advisor for an account. If you're able to go in and say, things aren't looking as good as we'd hope, what can we do to make it better? They'll trust you more, and they'll lead to a more successful outcomes for you. Around renewal, as you start engaging with the economic buyers, you're going to start talking about value and ROI. And this is really where, talking to what their goals were, and if those goals are around actual dollar value return on investment, or time savings, or efficiency in a particular organization. Those are all things that kind of go under the ROI bucket, and it's leading to how they're either becoming a more optimized organization, or how they're saving money with your platform. Benchmarking. So one of the key aspects of benchmarking is use and value projections. So when you start talking expansions and you start looking at growing your business within an account, this is really important, because now you can start to project value. So we did X, Y, and Z for this part of your organization, and we project that we can do this for this ABC for this part of your organization. That's really important to do. You have the evidence that it's worked for one team, and there's nothing better than showing evidence when it's fully aligned with the particular organization you're selling with. It's a lot more difficult to sell to a net new business and value project than it is to sell to an existing business and use their own data to show the value of your service. Okay, let's talk about scale. So scale is something that we hold near and dear to our hearts at Matik. Once you're ready you've got your narrative crafted, you've developed it, not in a vacuum, you've gotten feedback, you know what the most critical ROI and adoption supporting stats are in that presentation. Now it's all about scaling. So how do you get that in the hands of the right people? And more importantly, when you do get it into the hands of the right people, how do they get it into the hands of their customers? There's a lot of ways out there that people have tried to do this. Sales enablement teams are a critical part of this. Having tools available to you where people can find the presentations they need and generate them are also very important. In order to appropriately scale your content, you really need to have a mechanism in order to do so. So let's start with data insights and QA. QA is one of the most important parts of scaling any content. You need to make sure that you're testing for edge cases, that you are ensuring that when you have decided to scale your content, that you've gotten enough feedback, that you feel confident in it, that you've piloted it with people that have, that will actually be presenting this information. The second is feedback loop. So like I mentioned before, you should be treating these as living, breathing documents that you create, whether it's a quarterly business review or it's a adoption one-pager. You should really be treating these as things that are going to be evolving over time based on the feedback you're hearing from the field, based on feedback you're hearing from customers, based on how your product is evolving. The last one is around distribution, which I talked about a little bit already. So distribution, like I said, there's a lot of different ways you can do this. And it's really about making sure that not only do they have a mechanism to get the content that they need in order to present it in front of their customers, whether that's the right data insights or the right messaging, but it's also around how are you tracking this? If you do want wide adoption of the presentation you are building and the content you're building, you want to make sure that you have the ability to track it and hold people accountable for that. So different strategies to do that would be, tasks on Salesforce, for instance, tool tracking internally, and the analytics along with those tools that you're tracking internally. making sure that you're holding people accountable and then tracking not only if they're using it, but what are the outcomes when they are using it. So that really all falls under the distribution bucket and how to scale content appropriately. All right, next slide, please. All right, so let's see it in action. One of the things that people always love to see are example slides. So we're going to give you a little bit of that today, and then you have a place at the end where you can go ahead and download the full template. So let's talk about just a few slides, and this is sort of a kind of a standard business review template. Let's start with the executive summary. What everyone always says about the executive summary is that if one person was going to take only one slide from the deck and be able to summarize your intent, it should be this slide. So it should be concise. It should encompass what follows it, and it should be it should end with some sort of call to action on what you'd like to see from them or next steps you'd like to see from them. Again, one of the key parts in all slides is making sure that you're not over inundating them with content. So looking at this slide right here, this is kind of just a basic usage and adoption slide. But as you can see here, it's one chart and 3 data points. One thing that I've seen a lot throughout my career are slides with lots and lots of information with mixed messaging. Your slide should be telling a story, and your presentation should telling a story. You can kind of think of your presentation as a book, and the slides as chapters in that book. So they should be standalone and be telling a standalone story, but one that builds on each other. So here you'll see, again, basic usage information presented succinctly and with a clear point. So if you go to the next slide. So now let's talk about ROI. Same thing holds here. One of the things that people most get nervous about with ROI is objection handling. When you start putting dollar values to a service that might not have clear dollar value attribution, people get very nervous, particularly the person presenting it, because they're worried about people poking holes in it. But that's not really how you should be thinking about it. How you should be thinking about it is, okay, how can we work together to figure out what this product or service is doing for you? We have this supporting evidence based on your usage and adoption data. Now, how are we building on that to actually talk about the value? And so sometimes you use assumptions on things. So you're saving, your average employee earns this much, and we're saving them this much amount of time. We're estimating this much in dollar value return. Those are assumptions that you can tweak. It should be a collaboration on determining ROI, but what it should be is also them getting to think about value in your product. Now it's not about, okay, are you 5x the ROI, or are we having a conversation about value? Because as long as you're having that conversation about value, then you're having a positive conversation, even if you need to tweak assumptions going into return on investment. All right, so these are just a few slides. We do have actually a full template deck that the Matik design team put together. We've seen hundreds of QBRs and other sorts of CSM and sales collateral at Matik, and we've kind of we've learned from the best on what works and what can be improved, and we sort of put all that together in this slide templates that we're collecting. So please do take a moment and scan the QR code, which has a link to the presentation for you to download it. And if nothing else, you can use it for maybe inspiration on your next slide template. All right, so just to do a quick recap. So again, the 4 steps in creating data-driven content. Number 1, defining the customer journey. If you don't know what that is, then you really can't begin to create content to support that customer journey. Figuring out the story you want to tell. This should be cross-functional. It should have the team. It should have your customers involved in the process. It should really be something that you iterate on over time. Determining this data you need. So again, this is where you should be hearing from your customers, and you're listening to your product and the people that support your product. What supporting data do people find most valuable today? And how does that supporting data lead to a value-based conversation? Lastly is scale. So if you're not scaling your content, then what was the point of creating it in the first place? And that's something that probably is the most challenging out of all of these four. You can create something amazing, but if no one uses it, it's a bit of like a tree falls in a forest. So there's different ways to do this here at Matik. That's something we pride ourselves in, and we really try to do well. We've got some great customers we work with in order to achieve the scale they desire. All right, so I think we have some time at the end for Q&A. Happy to chat through any of that right now.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll just read off a few questions that we got, and then Spencer, I'll pass to you. So our first question is, how often do you think ROI data should be presented throughout the customer journey?
Yeah, it's a good question. Typically, if you're having early conversations, it should really be focused on the customer health and adoption of your product or service. If you're not ready to have that conversation, or if you don't know how your product is helping them lead to positive business outcomes, then you shouldn't force those conversations. And the number one reason you shouldn't force it is because the person presenting it might not be ready to, and you don't want people to poke holes in it. It's not maybe a comfortable conversation to have. It should definitely be part of the renewal conversation and value projecting into expansion, though.
Great. So our next question is, what should you do if the data that you have to share isn't favorable?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's something I mentioned earlier. Nobody should shy away from negative looking figures, especially early on in the contract. There's no better way to build trust with your customer than by showing them something that may seem negative, but is actually leading to a consultative conversation on how you can better improve your offering with them.
Awesome. So next question is, so if a customer's health score is low, or if they're giving warning signs of churn, what kind of data can you share with them, or would you recommend sharing to kind of help with that?
Yeah, often this is actually one of the key parts where you shouldn't always rely on just the data. Data tells one part of the story. One thing that we do on the account management side of Matik is really show the importance of end user listening sessions. Talking to your customers is one of the most important parts of figuring out what they value and what they maybe are missing out of the product. Those warning signs are great, but they're just indicators. If you're not talking to your customers and figuring out what they'd like to see and what's not working, then you're merely seeing part of the story.
Awesome. So our next question is, what story do you tell to customers at the onboarding stage? Is it kind of reflecting on what our most successful companies do, or something related?
You should always go in there with best practices in mind. People will often say, every customer is unique in their own way, which they are, but there are guide rails and or guardrails, I should say, that every customer should have. You should always have best practices for every step, but especially in implementation and onboarding. You should absolutely know what to look out for, and when things do happen, how to best support that. So again, it's really about making sure and giving them the confidence that you're the subject matter expert, especially as like a CSM, and that they can trust you and know that they're speaking to somebody that has their best interest in mind and is there for them, especially during such a critical part of the customer journey.
Awesome. So we'll go ahead and go to our last question. Thank you all for submitting your questions. But the next question will be, what data is most important to share at renewal?
What data? It's a pretty broad question, but it's a good question. You know, I don't like to think about data like a menu, that where it's like, what are the three things I should show? You should absolutely be showing some sort of value-based data. You should be showing supporting evidence. But it's really about, okay, what are your customers' goals and objectives, and how does that align to the feature that or product that they've purchased, and what are the supporting pieces of evidence that tie back to that feature. And so one of the things that one exercise that is particularly helpful there is having a value map. What are the customer's goals? Having that on the left-hand side. What are the things your product does to achieve that goals? And then what are the supporting pieces of evidence to do that on the further most right column? Having that sort of value map can be really helpful, because then you're having a tailored conversation with your customers. You're not just showing them data. If you just need data and you're using it as sort of a menu, you really run the risk of showing them things they just don't care about, and having a very winding conversation that doesn't actually lead to anything of a lot of substance.
Awesome. Thanks, Spencer. Well, yeah, I think that wraps us up for the day. Thank you all for submitting questions and attending.